Now may I introduce the moderator, ASCE Texas Section Transportation and Development Institute Chapter Representative, Gareth Young.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Anne-Marie. Thank you all for joining us today for the Texas Section T&DI webinar. I would like to take a moment to thank the branches for hosting viewing sites all over Texas. As the State Association for Civil Engineers, we're happy to provide this service to the engineering community. If you're not a member of ASCE, T&DI, or the Texas Section, I invite you to become a member so you can benefit from being part of this great professional organization. It's my honor to welcome today's presenter, Mr. Lauren Gardeno. Lauren serves as the TxDOT Director of Project Planning and Development, which includes the oversight of the transportation planning, programming, right-of-way, environmental, and probably most important for most of you, the professional engineering and procurement divisions. Lauren began his TxDOT career in 1987 in the Amarillo District and has held a variety of positions throughout the years. He's been the district engineer in Odessa and Abilene, the district engineer in San Angelo and Brownwood, the West Region Director, the Chief of Procurement, where he was responsible for integrating many of the department's support services. Lauren holds a master's degree in management and human relations from Abilene Christian University, a master's degree in civil engineering from Texas A&M University, and a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from Texas Tech University. Lauren has also received numerous peer recognitions with awards such as Young Engineer of the Year and Engineer of the Year from the Texas Society of Professional Engineers. And in 2001, Lauren was inducted into the Texas Tech Civil Engineering Academy. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lauren.
Thank you, Gareth. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of your program today. I guess mic check okay. Gareth, can you hear me all right?
Loud and clear.
Okay, great. So the topic that I've been asked to present to you is about maybe one of the major programs in our department, the Department of Transportation, and that is the planning and programming changes that are occurred in our 2017 Unified Transportation Program. The Unified Transportation Program is a 10-year plan. We call it a mid-range plan, and I'll explain to you in a minute, that guides us in our transportation development of our projects over that period of time. It is codified in Texas Administrative Code, and every year the planning cycle for this 10-year plan is updated and approved by our Transportation Commission on an annual basis. It's called a unified plan for this reason, because we do actually go ahead and show all of our other modes of transportation that were capitalized throughout the year, and so we just include them for informational purposes. A lot of them have their own independent funding sources, most of them federal, but includes our aviation program, our public transportation program, and even some of our state and coastal waterway programs, where the majority of that funding comes from the federal level. We are required to do a ranking of our projects as far as readiness goes, and that Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 ranking is what has been defined so far in our unified program. I will speak to some of the changes that have occurred since then, and some of the changes going forward. The presentation today is really focusing on the impact of some significant changes to this program that have occurred over the last year in response to legislative requirements coming out of the last legislative session on House Bill 20, and also in response to some funding infusions that we are anticipating receiving, coming from the passage of Proposition 1 and Proposition 7 over the last 18 months, that has actually given us a little bit of infusion of funding into this transportation program. I'll speak more details about that in a minute. But those two things, those two factors really have impacted the way we have gone forward this last year on this 2017 UTP, more so probably than in any previous annual UTP cycle, because of the impact on funding and the impact on House Bill 20 has made, particularly on performance metrics for this program. And so with that, I want to give you a big picture of where the UTP sits in our planning documents. You can see here that we have a lot of we have multiple planning documents that we do both with the Texas DOT and also with our planning and construction partners, that is our local metropolitan planning organizations. And so these various plans are kind of in a way embedded. These projects are kind of embedded within each other. The long-range plan that you see at the top of this list is a 25-year look at our program going down the road. Includes some of the significant potential projects that might be considered that we need to start development on, because we know it takes a long period of time to bring them to fruition. The MPOs are Metropolitan Planning Organization partners that have jurisdiction for planning and programming within these urbanized areas. They are required to put together a long-range plan, which is they call it their Metropolitan Transportation Plan. Those two plans kind of have to harmonize with what we're doing in this Unified Transportation Program, this 10-year program. And you kind of see it. This graph maybe not shows it too well, but you kind of see the long-range plan, the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. And by the way, there's over 25 of them across the state of Texas that we have to work with in those urbanized areas. Those plans basically you can see kind of feed into a 10-year Unified Transportation Program, of which again we have to rely back again on our MPOs partners, because they actually have to, for federal requirements, have to approve a 4-year TIP, Transportation Improvement Program, which you see on the bottom of this list. For us at TxDOT, it's called the Statewide Transportation Improvement Program. That's a 4-year window, and you kind of see it represented at the very top of this graphic, what we call the STIPs and the TIPs. So you can see this whole process is integrated in a lot of ways, and we have to make sure we work with our partners, our local planning partners, to make sure that the process moves the way it needs to move. I want to give you a picture of this 1-year cycle real quick and how that looks. And what starts with the very top is our financial forecasting staff gives us some planning forecast scenarios that we can reasonably anticipate will be the funding streams that we will receive over a 10-year window. And they have to make a lot of assumptions, and I'll show you those assumptions later. But one of the major changes that had occurred in this particular UTP update that we did here in August, going forward in 2017, was some of our past planning forecasts have been rather conservative, and conservative to the point that we didn't take into account some of the possible we didn't take into account possible some of the infusions of potential funding that comes to us from the federal level. We didn't fully allocate for maybe some of the state level funding, some of the gas tax funding, because we just were taking a very conservative approach of aligning our project portfolio up with our cash flow. This last year, our financial staff has made a determination that we need to, as far as a planning forecast goes, and that's what the UTP is, it's a planning forecast. We need to relax that. We're still fiscally constrained, but we need to relax that rigid control on our cash flow to the point that allows our planners to actually plan for projects in a significant amount of detail, that we can accommodate some of the fluctuations in our funding markets going forward, whether it's gas tax, Federal Highway Act programs, or any other types of funding, Prop 1, Prop 7, as I mentioned earlier. So that forecast now feeds a distribution strategy, and our commission every August has to approve how much money they want to put in different categories of funding that represent certain strategic objectives, and that becomes our distribution strategy. And after that is distribution strategy is identified, then we can get into project recommendation prioritization as we manage our project portfolio throughout the year. And then throughout the year, what happens is sometimes there's additional funding requests that come in, and we have to do an update to this UTP. We call it usually it's a mid-cycle update, usually around January, February, March, where we actually come back and make adjustments to our projects based upon some additional funding requests or funding infusions that may come in. And then because of that, we have to update this UTP. One of the outcomes, particularly of House Bill 20, and I'll show you some more on that in a minute, is that we have to get a little bit more transparent in the way we monitor the impacts of our decisions in this program. We have a lot of pressure coming at us both at the federal level for inducing performance metrics into the measurement of our assets on a state DOT. We now have, through House Bill 20, we have requirements that requires us to put more refinement and transparency in our performance metrics to measure our outcomes in this UTP. And so the back end of this process is some of the steps that we are actually perfecting, revising, continuously improving, you might say, as we continue to provide our commission with a better picture of what their investment strategy is buying them in this transportation program across the state. That's where you see those circles circling back around to adjusting the strategies, the investment strategies. And then really this doesn't show it probably adequately, but going into next summer's UTP approval process by August again, we will actually, our planning and forecast people will actually continue to take a look at our cash forecast to see if we're hitting our trends on our cash flow also and make adjustments as necessary. So this gives you kind of a quick overview of this 1 year program cycle. It's a 10-year planning document. It's a living document that you can see kind of moves through this process over a 1 year cycle. All of it has to be centered around putting out the department's, accomplishing the department's values, vision, mission, and goals and objectives with this transportation program. I mentioned House Bill 20 earlier. This is some impacts that affect us and the changes in this process going forward this last year. One of the requirements that came out of House Bill 20 was that the Commission, by rule, shall develop and implement a performance-based planning and programming process. Now, I will say we have had performance-based planning and we have had some performance-based programming, but what they meant by that was they wanted a little bit more rigor and a little more transparency in what that looks like. And so that was the pressure they put on us coming out of House Bill 20 to make sure that we lived up to that. They also wanted us to establish a performance-based process for setting funding levels for categories in UTP. I will also mention that we did have some processes for doing that historically, but the key thing, the key word I'll mention here is historically. A lot of our performance-based process for setting our funding levels in the Unified Transportation Program have been based upon trends of the past 4 or 5, 6 years of trends as it reflects in our pavement preservation, our safety, our congestion, our connectivity, so on and so forth. So we're attempting in this UTP cycle to actually try to build in some possible scenario-based impacts of our performance in a way that we might actually be able to project some possible outcomes depending upon our investment strategies going forward. This is what it kind of looks like. These are our UTP transportation program breaks up into what we call 12 categories, 12 funding categories. And just for everybody's benefit, in 2003 there was over 30-something categories. So if you're overwhelmed by the 12 looking at it right now, just imagine back in 2003 when we had over 30-something categories to manage. What we do is when I mentioned that the Commission will make decisions on their investment strategy, they make decisions on what is the right amount of money to put, for example, in preventative maintenance and rehab, which is Category 1, versus how much money they need to give to the metropolitan planning organizations to put in Category 2, which is spent within those urbanized metropolitan areas. Non-traditional funding is Category 3. We do still have some of that in this UTP. That represents basically some of the bonds and toll revenues received off of some of the state-owned toll system. And so that you see some revenue still generated in that category. It's not an active category for us per se in terms of some of this infusion of new funding, but it is still an existing amount. It's still a category that we have to account for. Category 4 here, statewide connectivity, now you're looking at how much money you want to put in strategic corridors across the state of Texas. Category 5 and Category 7, I'm skipping bridge, is 6 for a minute. These two categories linked together are federally funded programs that come to us out of your federal highway gas tax, come back to the metropolitan areas, particularly in this is congestion mitigation and air quality that they have to mitigate for, and this is some metropolitan mobility and rehab money that goes to these MPOs out of the federal highway gas tax. These two programs down here that I'm showing, bridge and safety, Category 6 and Category 8, sorry, I clicked the button. Category 6 and Category 8 are statewide programs that we manage on a statewide level through the districts, and there is a certain amount of funding that goes into them to address, in this case, our bridge program, and then also our safety program off the Highway Safety Improvement Program, we call it. Category 9 and 10 are small pots of money. If you ever heard the Department of Transportation talking about enhancement projects and any things that the locals went after for like maybe hike and bike trails and sidewalk improvements and things like that. Sometimes that's funded out of some of these supplemental transportation programs. And most of that is a federal dollar that comes back to us and it comes back to us, like I say, with strings attached to it. Says you got to spend it on these kinds of programs, and so that's why that category is created. The last two categories are the more discretionary categories. This is the district discretionary category that goes to the district engineer. We have 25 of them in the state of Texas, and these people get a chance then, of course, to utilize that, and they have a lot of discretion to spend it across maybe even some of these other categories to supplement with these categories to solve district issues as it relates to our strategic initiatives. And finally, and this is a big category for our Highway Commission, the House Bill 20 required that we would restrict the Commission discretionary spending to no more than 10% of our operating budget, our biennium operating budget, which the way it translates for us is about $10 billion over a 10-year period. And so the Highway Commission has strategic priority funding category to spend on strategic needs across the state of Texas. And I listed at the bottom how those investments, reach the Commission. A lot of them are defined by federal and state required minimums. So like I said, some of these categories I mentioned to you come just from federal dollar only, and then also, some of them have a certain allocation formulas. Category 2 to the Metro MPOs is distributed fairly across the state based upon a formula. Category 1 is distributed across the state based upon a formula, and I'll speak to that in a little bit in a minute. How does that look? You see the 12 categories, the funding to the right that I showed you on the previous screen, and you can kind of see where some of that cash forecast comes into play. Our finance folks actually take a look at all the federal funds that we anticipate getting in that 10-year window. They take a look at some of our state highway funds we anticipate getting in that 10-year window, and they also include some of our non-traditional funds that we can anticipate getting over that 10-year period of time. And that is what is distributed. That is what is given us a planning target that we can actually start to basically fill up these pots of money, categories over to the right. I highlighted some key things because these are key changes in this 2017 UTP. We had a federal highway bill passed. It was the FAST Act, and so we have an additional funding that came to us from the FAST Act that we're accounting for in our cash forecast. And then Citizens of Texas passed Proposition 1 and Proposition 7, and then also they made a decision, the legislation did, to end diversions to other state agencies out of the State Highway Fund. And that diversion ended was a tune of about $750 million a year that went back into the State Highway Fund to be used into some of these categories of funding. And then, of course, the non-traditional funds, some of those funds are slowly being phased out, but we still have some funds left in those accounts, and we're slowly utilizing them in what I call Category 3 non-traditional funded projects. This is what it looks like. When the Highway Commission passed the 10-year program, that you can see kind of where that money, these are planning targets, this is where it sits in this August UTP. And you can kind of get a feel for where they decided to invest their money. Now I'll make some notes here because one of the interesting things is one of the big changes to us was in this Category 4, Connectivity Corridor, both the urban and the rural area. The Commission chose to put $11.6 billion over 10 years for planning projects in this regional corridor, this connectivity corridors. We really have not had an infusion of this funding in this particular category of significance it goes back to about 2005. So we've gone through nearly 11 UTP update cycles where, we're actually each year you bring in the next year's worth of funding, and each year when you approve it on the 10-year window. So we've actually gone through a full 10-year UTP window with really no significant funding in this Category 4. This was a major change for us this year. So we're having to plan, staff is having to plan about how do we make sure we distribute that money correctly across the state on good, solid projects that meet performance metrics, that are in effect connecting transportation corridors across the state of Texas. The rehab money looks back, looks right. The MPO money, this is the MPOs used in those urbanized areas. The congestion error mitigation quality money is about the same as it would be. The metropolitan mobility money is, again, federal money goes out in the way it does. So you can kind of see real fast how this money was actually laid out over this 2017 UTP. I'll show you this slide, and I will come back to it later. because it really highlights an important point I want to make in planning. Because of House Bill 20, it says we got to start building performance metrics in our program. One of the struggles that we've had as an agency over the years is trying to measure the impact of our investment across these categories of funding. And so these numbers that you see that are in these boxes highlight basically what those previous slides I showed you, showing where the category 1, $13.8 billion is spent. But as you look at the top, when we start looking at our strategic initiatives that as an agency we're focusing on, you can see that we want to focus on safety. We want to focus on preserving our assets. We want to focus on congestion and mobility issues and then connectivity. You can see what I'm highlighting here is I'm showing you some shaded boxes in some of these other areas. And if I'm really updating the slide, I probably need to go back and put a shaded box here on connectivity now, because I think some of this maintenance and rehabilitation money that we're spending across the state, maintaining your pavement structures and those things, is actually having some positive impact, some influence. And I use the word utility. It's creating some utility or value in the area of safety, in the area of our bridge program, in the area of mobility and congestion. Same exercise goes for the Category 2 funding that the MPOs are spending in the urbanized areas. When they decide to add a lane, for example, for congestion to improve capacity, a lot of times they're not only going to add a lane, but they're actually going in there with their program and they're rehabilitating pavement structure, or they're improving a bridge structure. And so a lot of times we don't capture the inherent value that their Category 2 spend in metropolitan and urban corridors is having on some of these other strategic areas. That's been a weakness for us. Now we've tried to estimate it. We've tried to look at some historical data that says what the trends are. Back to my point about what is the right amount of money to put in those categories of funding. But you can see, we haven't been able to link the utility across, all of our strategic areas. I'll speak to that in a minute about some changes that we're doing to try to do so. But I'll come back to the slide so you can kind of see it. Just another note, the Category 11 district discretionary, this commission chose to take $2.1 billion over 10 years and focus on trying to solve some of our energy sector deterioration and damage that occurred to our payment structure in the energy sector regions. Specifically because also, if you go back and read what Prop 1 was, that it was passed, it was actually severance tax money coming into the state highway coffers from oil and gas severance tax. So, we're trying to put the money back in the places where it's generated, it's being generated from, and that's kind of where you see that focus of money going back into safety and preservation in the energy sector. We put it in the district engineer's account, gave us the discretion on that, so that he had the flexibility to build out that program the way he or she needs to. I'm going to spend a few moments talking about the additional funding in this UTP, because that's really what has driven a lot of the changes that we're trying to incorporate along with House Bill 20. The additional funding looks like this. Of the $70 billion UTP, we saw an infusion of about $38.3 billion of planning target funding over that 10-year period. So you can see real quick how our planning portfolio changed radically, nearly overnight, when we go from a 10-year program that is about half of what it was going forward in the 10-year program. So we wake up one day in August and realize, you know what, we're doubling basically the program that we're going to try to get out the door, and this has impacts all across the board. This $70 billion that I've been quoting to you is construction dollar only, present day value. That does not account for, and we have to account for, and we will, that basically says a 10-year UTP will go through 5 legislative appropriation request cycles, because the legislation meets every 2 years. And every 2 years we have to submit as an agency a budget, a legislative appropriations budget for us to operate our agency. And this cash forecast is given to us for planning on the $70 billion target over 10 years. Our financial staff has already pulled out of those cash forecasts the amount of money that we need to set aside to request out of those funding sources for right-of-way, for engineering, and project development costs that's going to occur over that 10-year period of time. So really, when we talk about a $70 billion transportation program, from the standpoint of construction dollar, if you look at it from total project cost, it's really going to be closer to about a $90 billion program, because that's about $20 billion over 10 years in those 3 areas that we're talking about developing out. So it's pretty incredible, pretty significant change that has occurred to us, in this fusion of funding that came to us. And you can see where the money's coming from. 6.3 from Prop 1, 21.8 from Prop 7, and there's some discussion on Prop 7 specifically, especially in light of some of the recent forecasts that came from the Comptroller's office this week, and we can talk about that in a minute. So the second thing driving it was the performance objectives for additional funding. You know, we have a governor that was want to focus on some congestion issues in our major metropolitan areas that are clogged. So the governor gave the department a charge to, you know, focus on congestion mitigation, and we have a term for that. It's called Texas Clear Lanes that we are actually initiating, and we actually have 5 metropolitan district engineers working with MPOs to target some of the most congested bottlenecked areas in the state of Texas. And we actually have planning dollars already going into effect. We have, you know, consultant engineers already on board doing a lot of work. For example, of the 100 most congested roadway segments in the state of Texas, we have work authorizations working from consultants working on at least on 60 of those segments today. So we've got planning going, and we've got engineering going to get ready for this initiative, the $70 billion of construction that we're going to put out the door. We actually have we actually have guidance also from House Bill 20, and we've had actually public input from our MPOs and our planning organizations as we try to develop performance objectives for this funding. And then the key focus is we've got to define our current goals and objectives for TxDOT and make sure that we are aligned with our strategic vision of what we want to look like over the next 25 years. So for us, as an agency, our strategic priorities were address safety. You can see some of the outcomes we want to target on. These are high level, folks, so I mean, I won't get into detail about all the metrics we're using to measure this, but you can see address safety, preserve assets. We do have to maintain and preserve our system. We've got over 85,000 miles of highways in the state of Texas, 182 lane miles, 182,000 lane miles. I mean, it's a pretty big, 192,000 lane miles. It's a big system, and it's not going away, and so we have to continue to preserve it. But in the meantime, we've got population explosions in the state of Texas, and the number coming to Texas on a monthly basis is incredible, of which 75 to 80% of that is projected to be in these metropolitan areas. So we've got to look at mitigating congestion and improving the reliability of our system. So we are focusing on that. And then, like I said, for the first time in 10 years, this commission has chosen to go back and look at our rural connectivity corridors again to make sure that we can get across the state of Texas in an appropriate fashion as we look at freight routes, hurricane routes, border trade routes. Those are all those kind of things being considered in this connectivity, connecting Texas populations. And then one addition this year that I'll speak to in a minute was the commission also decided to focus on putting some money inside some urbanized areas for corridors so that we can remove some of the bottlenecks that occur. Like, for example, if you want to get across the state of Texas from point A to point D on one of your highway systems, whether it be interstate or state highway, you don't want to get choked down in points B and point C going through a town or a community because we don't have any funding earmarked to do that. And so this corridor funding actually is helping us work on that also. And then we want to continue to leave ourselves open to focus on strategic initiatives, including trade, energy sector, and economic development. And that becomes basically our strategic priorities for the department. How does that new money look like? How did it break out when they were looking at their funding scenarios? You can kind of see real quick. They decided to put, invest $6.9 billion of that $38 billion in preservation, safety. And you see kind of how it sub-breaks, and these basically translate to some of those categories I showed you earlier. You can see we're focusing $21.2 billion of this new money in congestion and urban mobility. The bulk of that is this Clear Lanes initiative that that you may be hearing about. If you haven't, keep listening, because one of our highway commissioners, Bruce Bugg, has been going around pushing the Texas Clear Lanes initiative. And then, of course, we're dedicating $6.2 billion of this $38 billion over rural connectivity, leaving about $4 billion for strategic priorities across the state. We did look at some historical performance or some historical impact from the standpoint of making sure that this funding is actually still aligning with some of the needs across the state, because one of the pressures put upon us as an agency was they said, TxDOT, you got to make sure you do fair and equitable distribution also. So that's the challenge, and that's the difficulty of planning this program, is you got to balance the needs of fair and reasonable needs across the state versus putting a performance metric to make sure we're putting the funding where it needs to be. So you got to balance those two. One of the checks that we do have is we do take a quick look at our vehicle miles traveled across the state of Texas, and we look at the rural portion versus the urban portion. You got to kind of get a feel of kind of what that looks like. And then we did a look at this additional funding that we were refusing to see if kind of where we're mixing some of that. So we took out some that is discretionary and included in this list, but that 27 of that $38 billion was compared to some of the highway vehicle miles traveled, and you kind of see that the ratio kind of looks pretty good, and we kind of hit that number a little bit. So that was attempting to try to do some fair and equitable distribution for the needs. You know, people say, well, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. I think that was maybe a Star Trek scene at one point. But what we're saying is that, you know, urban, we don't want to try to pit the competition between the urban congestion needs versus some of the rural connectivity needs. Because even though we recognize that the population centers, the bulk of the population centers are east of 35, there's still a need to get those tomatoes to market, or get that wheat product to market, or get that cattle to market from some of your West Texas regions, or get that oil to market. And so we still have to accommodate our corridors that way too. So that looks this way, and you see it. The priorities include safety in Category 8. There's an increase. We increased the Category 1 in terms of that new funding. You see how it broke out there. I mentioned the bridges, that we did increase the existing funding in our bridges by 17%. Some of our strategic goals is to have, you know, we had a commissioner back in 1999, nearly 2000, made a charge to the department, said we want to, you know, by a certain time frame, we want our bridges in 90% good or better condition rating. Of course, that condition rating is subject to debate about a structurally deficient bridge versus a functionally obsolete bridge. As a department, we want to make sure we tackle the structurally deficient first, because we feel like that is a high critical priority over a functionally obsolete. Realizing, though, functionally obsolete meaning maybe too narrow of a bridge, there may be some safety issues there, and we do need to go back and address that also. But you know, and so we try to do an investment strategy in bridges that actually keeps our bridge program, you know, up there in the, you know, in the high 80s. Trying to target 90%. To get to 90% means you may have to invest more money in bridges to be able to do that. But you see the focus on energy sector, we put money there, and of course we still left the districts of discretionary money there. I mentioned the clear lanes. Target for Category 12 commission discretionary, they said they would take $5 billion of their $9.8 billion, and they would put it specifically on strategic congestion initiative in the 5 metro areas that are most congested in the state of Texas, where the bulk of the 100 segments are. That would be Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, San Antonio, and Houston. That's where the bulk of, that's where this $5 billion is targeted for. And we, of course, using some project recommendations and some prioritization criteria based upon some of those congestion issues. And then I told you about the Category 4 money. Some of it going into the mobility area. We did target out of that 11.2 in Category 4, we did target $5 billion of it to go inside some urbanized areas. The caveat to that is that it needs to stay on those strategic corridors that are running across the state of Texas. So, for example, Interstate Highway 35 that runs through Austin area here today. In the past, the old Category 4 category in the early 2000s, you could spend the Category 4 on the rural portion of the category, but you can never spend that money into the urbanized area. We're now opened it up where you can spend a little bit of that money in the Austin 35 to kind of allow our district engineer, Terry McCoy, to fix maybe some of the 35 issues up and down in this. But what he can do then is he can combine this funding with some of the Category 2 MPO money, with some of the Category 12 commission clear lane money to try to start solving some of his congestion issues on the 35 corridor through Austin, for example. That's kind of how we target this money. So congestion urban mobility, I mentioned that earlier. That's what it looks like. And I'll show you an example of how you can utilize multiple categories of funding to solve your problem on congestion and mobility. And you can see how, you know, out of that $70 billion program, you know, we've got 28.9 that we actually can use to try to solve some of the congestion issues we see in the state. I mentioned the rural connectivity corridors, connectivity to rural areas. Just so for your benefit on what is a rural connectivity corridor priority. Today we've identified some existing strategic corridors, and I'll make a note about this because people are saying, well, do we need to add to it? Do we need to take away from it? Interesting thought. This agency is 100 years old this year, and there was a map that came out in 1917 when the Texas Highway Department, or the Highway Department, was stood up. And if you go back and look at that corridor map, it was the first basically planning corridor map across the state of Texas. And it's interesting to look at that and then look at it today and see how many of these corridors are actually still pretty much aligned with that corridor map in 1917. We still see it. And in fact, we have one of our folks that retired in the 80s and early 90s. Mark Yancey was one of our executive administrators. He oversaw planning there in the 70s and the 80s. And he actually, there's a picture of him showing up a map of their planning map of the 70s. And interesting enough, it looked very much like the maps that we saw in 1917, very much like the map that we are going off of today. What I'm saying is we're not going to relocate and realign interstate corridors. We have an identified Texas trunk system that was identified in the 1990s. We're not going to go back and realign the Texas trunk system. We have, in recent years, picked up a freight network corridor on a federal requirement. We have actually been focusing on some border trade corridors. We actually, in the recent 10, 15 years, have identified hurricane evacuation routes and port routes. But those routes, a lot of them are congruent with the existing planning corridors that we have across the state. Super 2s, it's a new term for us. Maybe you may not have heard of it, maybe you have. We call a Super 2 corridor is some of our rural areas of the state where we were running out of money, Category 4 money. The decision was made in the late 2000s that we could possibly do some capacity enhancements without having to build a 4-lane divided highway. So within the existing right-of-way of our state corridors, we were able to go in there and put what we call passing lanes, extended passing lanes for stretches of miles, and then signing for it so that the driving public could see, for example, the next passing lane would be so many miles. And you could take a segment of that corridor, you take a 50, 60-mile segment of that corridor and build alternating passing lanes to that corridor. We call those Super 2 corridors. And that's the definition of that term and how it's used. And we have a lot of that across the state of Texas in some of our rural areas that we're still trying to build out today. And then I mentioned earlier the energy sector. This is things that we're allowing for. And I won't spend a lot of time on this page because I've already spoken to it. I think I want to get to the last few minutes I have talking about some of the new performance metrics that we're doing. So performance-based process. You can see I've highlighted the top 2 boxes, the distribution strategy and the project representation and prioritization strategy. Those are the 2 areas that we're kind of overhauling in our UTP for our annual updates. You can see the 2017 UTP, we made some adjustments to the distribution strategy that the Commission chose to put those pots of money in, funding in, and we try to build in some House Bill 20 objectives, some performance-based allocations, and some of the requirements of that. In the future update, the future UTPs, which we'll have a new one in 2000, we'll call it, it's actually in August of 2017, but it's the 2018 UTP. We will use, by then, we hope to be able to be refined and more mature in our performance metrics so we can use House Bill 20 performance metrics criteria for our targets and our strategic goal areas going forward. The project recommendation and prioritization, right now this update, we're doing what we can to get part of this program allocated in this 10-year window and adapt and align current project selection methods to some of these performance objectives that are required by House Bill 20. But in the future update, the UTPs, as we update on an annual cycle, we want to review and enhance project selection and prioritization using improved metrics from House Bill 20 processes. So I only show you these 2 parts of that cycle, which is it's the same cycle basically as that circle cycle I showed at the beginning, but I want you to focus on this is some of the things that we're doing in this to change. Commission by rule shall develop and implement performance metrics and measures. I mentioned that to you earlier, and a scoring system for prioritizing projects for which financial assistance is sought by planning organizations. Here's what that looks like in the future for us. We have to give consideration to performance metrics and funding distributions. We really want to realign our planning steps to apply performance metrics to future funding, and we got to still balance the diverse needs of the state. We've got to increase the visibility of investment impacts across the 12 funding categories. So I showed you that slide earlier that kind of showed all those checkered boxes. This is addressing that. We have to be able to link our project performance criteria to TxDOT's overall strategic goals. So we've got to be able to show that in our project selection prioritization. We have to use project readiness and funding availability to optimize our portfolio not necessarily select projects. And so what does that look like? Today, if I gave you a process for project selection, it's usually 2 steps. Commission says we're going to put so much money in category 2. This is just an example. We put so much in metro urban corridors. It's distributed to the MPOs by formula. That's the fair and equitable distribution. MPOs develop their project program right here, and then the projects, that's the step 2. We would actually have to come back and we develop a project recommendation criteria to achieve performance measure targets and then rank projects. We rely upon the MPOs, for example, in this category to do that. We need a way, though, to be able to take their ranking and bake that into our overall 10-year program in the UTP. And that's some of the work that we're doing today. This I show you is an existing methodology that we use to score our projects in this 10-year UTP. And if you look at it, I'll just tell you real quick, it has some flaws to it. It was the best it was at the time, but this is stuff that's being completely overhauled because of the House Bill 20 requirements. Really, today, ranking projects as a Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3 project to move forward, we're giving only about 34% of the value of that project towards our strategic initiatives, whereas we're baking in 66% of that project's priority based upon whether there's funding available for it or where the project is in the development cycle. These performance metrics are really not strategic performance metrics related to these strategic initiatives. Rather, these are more production performance metrics. Is your project on time and on budget? We're not going to throw these things away, but the point I'm making here is going forward, we're not going to use project development and funding availability to make a decision on which projects we need to put into our UTPQ or UTP project portfolio. These metrics will be used later as we develop our projects to determine if it's moving through our UTP funnel on time and on budget. That's how we will use that. So we had to move away from this. How do we do that? We procured a tool, Decision Lens. It improves prioritization and optimization in our portfolio. How does it do it? It actually links that utility. So now our project not only scores in category 1 on pavement preservation, we are actually able to show the utility of that project towards safety and also maybe bridges or maybe connectivity or even congestion. I'll show you an example of this. We're actually going to be able to provide scenario-based analysis going forward around the efficiency and effectiveness of our performance of our projects. Instead of having just to look at historical data to see how we trended, we're also going to be able to look at some scenario-based data to see what, if we invest in this strategy, what will it get us, on our performance metrics. And so the goal is for the commission is that every August when they have to decide how much money to put in those 12 categories of funding, they have to answer the question, what is the what-if scenarios in funding allocations? We think we'll be able to load them up with the tools they need to answer that question about how much money they should put in each one of those targeted 12 categories. This is an example. It's an example only. And I need to move this so you can see the questions being asked. So let me show you. This doesn't represent our text.utp. It represents how this decisioning tool is going to help us make better performance investment strategies. So these are four strategic values that, and they actually seem to line up with some of the 4 that we have. Bridge and paving condition are both preservation values for us. Safety, congestion, well, we'd have to build another one in this process, mobility, but we can. But this shows you the example of how this decisioning tools will help us make better decisions. And that is, it goes like this. This green bar down here shows you how much we're spending in our current investment level. Let's assume hypothetically it's the $70 billion planning target in this 10-year UTP. So based on the $70 billion planning target and where we decide to put that money in the 12 categories, we can anticipate over that 10-year window that this is where you will be with your freight congestion, with your bridge conditions, with your safety, and with your pavement conditions. Now this is not real life, because if I was doing a real life scenario, I would probably put this bubble a little further down, maybe not even into the good, as we look at congestion across the state. But it's just an example, and I just want to point it out for purposes of demonstrating this tool. So the question then becomes, what if we want to increase our investment level? And if you can see that little box to the bottom right, I'll try to move this so you can see it. Let me move that. Sorry, I don't want to take too much time, but basically, if you want to invest increase your investment, what does that do? So if you say we get an infusion of federal dollars, maybe federal ARA money, or maybe Donald Trump decides to give us a bunch of money out of the new Federal Highway Act, who knows? What does that look like? We increase the investment level, then we can see based upon the projects that we've selected in our portfolio, this is what you can anticipate your program would look like over that 10-year period of time. It actually shows us move the needle, improvements. Realistically, will that happen? I don't know. So let's ask another question. What if we had to achieve a target? So what if we said we're going to set the bar on best in class for safety? We're going to we got to move this up, which means we got to spend more money in our safety program. If we do that with holding our investment level the same, something's going to have to give. You can see where it gives. In this case, it probably pushes your bridge program down a little bit and increases your congestion issue. You have worse congestion to get it best in class in safety. Those are the decisions our commission now will be armed with, hopefully going forward and by this August update, or August UTP, to make better decisions. Here's another example. What if we want all of the best performance? So if the legislature says, all right, TxDOT, how much money do you need to get best in class across all of your strategic objectives? So we move the needle on all of them up to where we need to move them. Okay, well, policymaker, we need this much, instead of 70 billion, we need 90 billion over 10 years to be able to move the needle. We need 100 billion, so on and so forth, to make that kind of improvement. That is how the decision tool will be used to help us fill in the dollars, the impact that our investment is making on these other areas across this chart that I showed you earlier. So with that, I think I've talked about this again, about distribution strategy, project prioritization. We will use the decision lens tool on the back end of this to refine our recommendation prioritization, to adjust our investment strategies till we go into the next August redistribution of funding. When I say redistribution, we're not going to completely wholesale pull money out of one pot and put it in another category pot, but rather each year our cash forecast says you get an additional year's worth of funding to put in your forecast. Do you want to make adjustments to your categories of funding as you get this infusion of new money every year on your cash forecast? I close with this. This is what we call our TxDOT funnel, and it's called a funnel because in the past with our conservative planning forecast, cash forecast, a lot of times our districts were developing projects that looked like a tube in that 10-year window, and they're trying to get projects from development authority into the construction authority, which means basically into a 2-year letting schedule. We have gotten the finance folks to agree to open up the forecast to give us a planning forecast, which makes it look more like a funnel. The reason that's a funnel basically says that as the department, we can work on more projects in these outer 10 years to get ready, realizing that as you get through these stage gates, you got to start selecting which projects are going to move forward into the 4-year window and into the 2-year letting, and that is more constrained by the annual cash flow that comes to us on our 2-year letting cycle. Keep in mind the LAR process, the letting budget for construction, we get it on that 2-year cycle. So that is our big proposed TxDOT planning portfolio, and you can see what drives it on a long-range plan needs to be our safety initiative, our preservation initiative, our congestion initiative, and our connectivity initiative. So those are some of the things that we have. With that, I think that concludes it. I will open it up for questions. Sorry, I may have taken too long, Garth, but I hope that allows some time.
Oh, no problem at all, Lauren. Are there any questions from the audience? I don't see any on the message board yet. We'll give it just a moment or two. If anyone has any questions, please enter them now. As Lauren mentioned, we're approaching the end of our allocated time. Lauren, while we're receiving any questions from the audience, you touched on it briefly, but could you look at your crystal ball, and given the comptroller's report earlier this week on the revenue forecast, just kind of expand on your thoughts on the near-term impacts of that?
Sure. Let me pull this up, and I'll talk off of this slide right here. Just kind of show it real quick. So the way we've tried to put this portfolio in place is if the cash forecast comes back to us and comptroller says you're not going to get 70 billion, particularly in that Prop 1, we think there's going to be a lower forecast in Prop 1 is much more than Prop 7. So you're not going to get that 6.3 billion over 10 years in Prop 1. It's going to be a smaller number because the oil and gas severance tax is coming a lot lower. The way we've designed this program in a way is that really what we've done is we want to continue to let our department and our districts continue to plan their projects. That $70 billion threshold might be a $68 billion or $65 billion over 10 years, given the new cash forecast. That's okay. If they squeeze our funnel down a little bit because the cash flow doesn't come in like we anticipate, bottom line is we just speed up or slow down, in this case slow down, the amount of projects that we're going to let into the 4-year window that we let into the 2-year window to let. But the idea is, and we're not there today, the idea is that we continue to develop more projects out here, especially in this yellow area. We develop more projects than what we have money for, because we're assuming that it's a funnel. So, we want more projects so that we can start making decisions on moving projects in and out of those stage gates, depending upon the restrictions of flow coming from these forecasts. Now, we anticipate there will be a smaller forecast on Prop 1. What we have to also anticipate is we have to be able to plan for, and our goal is to have extra projects available to plan for whatever possible stimulus may come at us from the federal level. That happened to us 4 years ago, when the ARA funding, which is a federal stimulus package, came to us. Money came to the department, came to the state, but it had strings attached to it. At the end, we were able to accommodate it because we had a lot of extra projects ready to go. Today, we kind of exhausted that shelf of projects, so we're in the process of continuing to ramp up again with projects to be able to anticipate possible future funding infusions. And that's okay if it stops and the funding slows down, then basically we are in a position where we have projects ready to go in case it starts to open up again. And that's how we plan to use that and prepare for that.
Fantastic. So we have one question from the audience. Really, the other direction. We heard about the reduced local revenue, but there's been a lot of talk in the national stage about an increase in infrastructure spending. Especially with the new Trump administration. Can you just speak on that briefly? And I think you hit on it in a couple of levels. Just talk about the funnel, but
yeah. Let me hit on it real quick. Let me see if I can do it real fast. So what happens, for example, if the federal highway funds come to us and the Trump administration says, we want to give Texas, we want to give you more funding, but we don't want to give it to you in a traditional gas tax through this FAST Act. More so, they're going to say, we want to give it to you in a non-traditional format, which basically says, you want these funding, you got to go after like more P3s and those kind of things. So I guess y'all have heard that. The department is not completely unfamiliar with using, P3 investment strategies to be able to fund our program. If the federal program comes to us in more public-private partnerships, we actually are in a position where we can manage that. Now, I will say this. Our current Prop 1 and Prop 7 and the will of this legislature and the will of the governor is we didn't want to spend Prop 1, Prop 7, which was state dollars, on toll roads, and that is the mantra. That's where we're going forward with that. But so everybody understands, not all public-private partnerships has to be a toll road. There could be some other investment strategies, some other repayment strategies for this private infusion of funding. So if the Trump administration gives it to us in a non-traditional format, we are geared, we are prepared to actually enter into that arena. If they give it to us in more traditional format, federal funds like the additional FAST Act, we will be prepared to go into that arena too.
Fantastic. Well, I think we're just about out of time. So, on behalf of the Texas chapter of TNDI and the Texas section, Lauren, I really want to thank you for a fantastic presentation. I think I can speak for all of us that, you really exceeded our expectations here. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thanks. I'd also like to thank all the participants who attended today's webinar. As Anne-Marie mentioned before, individual registrants should receive an attendance acknowledgement without any further action. And for those of you that attended as a group, the site coordinator will receive the PDH certificates for distribution. I hope you can join us for our next TNDI webinar, which will be more development focused, which will be on March 8th at noon, when Colonel Waterworth of Texas A&M will be discussing the Ike Dike, the proposed coastal barrier protecting the Houston-Galveston region and affecting development opportunities along there. In the meantime, I invite you all to visit the Texas Section website at texasce.org to register for webinars, learn more about the association, and take advantage of the benefits of membership. You can also view previous webinars from 2016 on demand and earn PDHs that way. I'm always available for questions, and we're always looking for people that are looking to get more involved with the Texas chapter of TNDI, and we look forward to hearing from you soon. Thanks for your attendance, and have a great day. Thanks again, Lauren.
This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. The session will now close.
Hmm.